Russia's front line just collapsed near Pokrovsk, and the footage the Kremlin never wanted you to see is finally out. What happened in those last 48 hours is so brutal, even Moscow's loyal channels are panicking. Before we reveal the battlefield truth, they tried to bury, hit that subscribe button and Abu, because what you're about to see will be taken down anywhere else. Stay locked in. This full report exposes everything. Massive losses reported near Pokrovsk. Russia faces major setback. The battlefield around Pokrovsk has shifted once again. And this time, the consequences for Russian forces are far heavier than the Kremlin is ready to admit. What began as a slow, grinding push has turned into one of the most damaging episodes Moscow has faced in months, exposing weaknesses at every level of command and raising urgent questions about the future of Russia's offensive strategy in eastern Ukraine. For weeks, Russian units had attempted to tighten pressure on the Pokrovsk axis, hoping to punch through Ukrainian defensive belts and secure a path toward deeper strategic targets. But as the fighting intensified, the cost of each kilometer grew unsustainable. What Russian planners assumed would be a calculated advance quickly transformed into a costly trap, one that Ukrainian forces exploited with precision. Troop concentrations, prepared in haste and sent forward with limited coordination, walked straight into layered artillery zones that had been mapped out long before the offensive began. Ukrainian drones, scanning the terrain day and night, identified buildup after buildup, relaying coordinates to gunners capable of responding in minutes. The results were devastating. Columns meant to reinforce the front line found themselves stalling, then scattering, then disappearing under a storm of explosive strikes. As the pressure mounted, Russian commanders attempted to redirect their assault toward flanking positions, hoping to relieve the battered frontline units. But this shift only exposed more vulnerabilities. Communication breakdowns caused units to move without support. Logistics convoys became easy prey. Armored vehicles rushed into the battle without reconnaissance, found themselves immobilized in fields softened by rain and churned up by weeks of shelling. Within days, Russian casualty reports, usually suppressed or diluted, began leaking through unofficial channels. Videos from soldiers' families, intercepted complaints from mobilized troops, and footage posted by frontline paramedics painted a picture far more serious than Moscow's official narrative. The scale of the losses near Pokrovsk was far larger than expected, large enough that even pro-Kremlin bloggers, usually aligned with official messaging, began raising alarms. For Ukraine, the situation represented not just a tactical success, but a critical reinforcement of their defensive credibility. The Pokrovsk sector had been under threat for months, with analysts warning that a major breach could destabilize a wider portion of the Donetsk front. Instead, Ukrainian units displayed a high level of coordination, blending drone reconnaissance, artillery timing, anti-armor teams, and well-prepared fallback positions into a seamless defensive web. As the fighting continued, more evidence emerged of Russia's internal strain. Units composed of recently mobilized soldiers complained of being pushed into the bloodiest sectors with minimal training. Battalion commanders begged for reinforcements that either never arrived or arrived too late. Evacuation routes became congested, creating bottlenecks that Ukrainian operators recognized instantly and targeted without hesitation. Satellite imagery soon confirmed what frontline reports had already suggested. Large numbers of Russian armored vehicles lay destroyed or abandoned across the approaches to Pokrovsk, scattered in small clusters that indicated chaotic retreat rather than organized withdrawal. Some machines were burned beyond recognition. Others sat intact but empty, suggesting crews fled under pressure or lacked the fuel to continue. Back in Moscow, the political ramifications grew harder to contain. A wave of criticism swept through military channels, challenging the Ministry of Defense's strategy and demanding accountability for the miscalculations that led to the Pokrovsk disaster. Hardline commentators, usually supportive of aggressive offensives, openly questioned whether Russia's command could sustain repeated losses on this scale. At the same time, Ukrainian morale surged. Soldiers on the ground described the battle as one of the most intense, but also one of the most decisive in recent months. They kept coming, one Ukrainian drone operator said in a frontline report, but every time they massed, we saw them. Every time they moved, we tracked them. They walked right into every mistake they could make. The sentiment echoed widely across Ukrainian units. The defense of Pokrovsk had become a symbol of resilience, intelligence, and precise adaptation to modern warfare. Still, the fighting is far from over. Russia, despite suffering what analysts estimate could be one of its worst single area losses in weeks, continues to deploy new waves of troops in an attempt to regain momentum. Ukrainian commanders warn that Moscow may attempt another large push once reinforcements arrive, possibly shifting tactics to compensate for the failures exposed in the last offensive. International observers are watching closely. The Pokrovsk setback has the potential to influence wider strategic decisions, not only for Russia but for partner nations evaluating Ukraine's defensive capacity. Western analysts highlight that the effectiveness demonstrated around Pokrovsk could strengthen arguments for increased military aid, particularly in drones, counter-battery systems, and electronic warfare equipment, the very tools that shaped the battlefield outcome. Meanwhile, inside Russia, a different conversation is emerging. Families of mobilized soldiers are demanding clearer information about the fate of their sons and husbands. Regional governors are quietly preparing statements that acknowledge rising casualty numbers, though still avoiding direct criticism of the central government. The mood among frontline troops has reportedly shifted from determination to confusion as rumors spread about depleted battalions and missing commanders. But despite the chaos, Russia continues to insist that its objectives remain unchanged, even as the losses around Pokrovsk cast doubt on the feasibility of those ambitions. The question now is how the Kremlin will recalibrate its strategy after such a major setback, and whether it can maintain the manpower and equipment necessary to sustain operations at this intensity. Yet on the ground, the reality is unavoidable. The fields, roads, and forests near Pokrovsk now tell the story far louder than any official statement. Burned out vehicles, craters stretching across the horizon, equipment abandoned in panic, layers of shattered armor marking the routes of repeated, failed assaults. And amid it all, Ukrainian forces continuing to hold their lines, absorbing the pressure and responding with calculated strength. The battle for Pokrovsk has become more than a local engagement. It is a reflection of the broader struggle, the immense human cost, and the evolving nature of the war itself. The losses Russia suffered here will echo through its ranks for months. And for Ukraine, this moment reinforces a message it has sent again and again, that every inch of ground is contested, every advance is costly, and every attempt to break their defenses will be met with fierce resistance. Russian military analysts are now quietly acknowledging what the Kremlin refuses to say publicly. The setback near Pokrovsk was not just the result of one bad decision or one miscalculated offensive. It was the culmination of months of mounting strain, structural weaknesses, and a growing disconnect between field commanders and their superiors. Inside Russia's tightly controlled information space, even loyalist figures are hinting that the Pokrovsk losses represent something deeper. A sign that the human wave, tactics Moscow, increasingly relies on are reaching their breaking point. Reports from surviving Russian soldiers describe units thrown into battle with little understanding of the terrain, forced to rely on outdated maps or vague orders delivered over unreliable radios. Several accounts mention entire platoons going missing after night assaults that lacked drone support, leaving them blind to Ukrainian defensive positions. In some cases, drones intended to guide Russian units were grounded by Ukrainian electronic warfare, leaving infantry exposed and directionless. What was intended to be a coordinated push devolved into fragmented, unsupported attacks. As Ukrainian forces monitored these movements, they identified the weaknesses instantly. Recon operators described the Russian advances as predictable, even repetitive. They attacked from the same direction 3 times, one Ukrainian soldier said. By the third wave, we had every firing position ready. Such mistakes magnified the scale of the losses, turning what could have been a temporary setback into a full-blown collapse of several Russian assault groups. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drone teams continued their precision work, combining commercial drones, FPV units, and long-range reconnaissance platforms to create an overlapping surveillance network. Every movement, every regrouping, every attempted advance was tracked. Drone operators, often young volunteers trained rapidly but effectively, became one of the decisive factors in shaping the battlefield. Their ammunition was limited, but their information was endless. And with that information, Ukrainian artillery units could strike with speed and accuracy that Russian forces struggled to match. As Russia scrambled to stabilize the front, evidence of the chaos grew. Emergency field hospitals reported being overwhelmed, with medics forced to triage under fire. Mortuary services, which traditionally operate quietly in the background of wartime logistics, were suddenly stretched thin. Videos circulated showing long queues of medical evacuation vehicles stalled on rural roads, unable to move toward the front or retreat to safer ground. Ukrainian strikes on these choke points further compounded the disarray, destroying vehicles and blocking routes critical for both reinforcements and evacuations. Inside the Russian command structure, the pressure intensified. Officers who openly questioned the Pokrovsk offensive were sidelined, reassigned, or ignored. Others, fearing repercussions, chose silence even as conditions worsened. The result was a paralysis of decision, making that prolonged the disaster. Reinforcement orders were delayed or contradictory, causing entire units to wait in exposed positions without clear instructions. Some soldiers described being stuck in trenches for days, watching drones circle overhead and wondering when, not if, artillery fire would strike. Ukrainian units, sensing the growing panic across their adversaries' lines, began conducting small but decisive counterattacks. These weren't large-scale thrusts aimed at reclaiming vast territory. Instead, they targeted the weakened nodes of Russia's front line, vulnerable observation posts, understrength platoons, disorganized trench networks. These tactical victories pushed Russian forces back in key areas, widening the gaps and revealing how brittle the offensive had become. The psychological toll on Russian troops grew rapidly. Mobilized soldiers posted voice notes to relatives, some describing the battlefield as impossible, others admitting that commanders had abandoned them. A number of intercepted communications reveal panic, confusion, and anger. Phrases like "we're surrounded," "no support," and "no ammunition left" appear repeatedly. It became clear that Russian units near Pokrovsk lacked not only equipment but also trust in leadership, trust in logistics, trust in the mission itself. In Ukraine, the mood was the opposite. Commanders praised the discipline and coordination of their forces, emphasizing that Pokrovsk demonstrated what could be achieved when modern warfare is approached with adaptability rather than brute force. Soldiers who participated in the defense described the battle as exhausting but also empowering. Weheld, one infantryman said, "We proved they can be stopped." That sense of accomplishment rippled through other sectors of the front, strengthening Ukrainian resolve at a time when many feared Russian momentum was building too quickly. Beyond the battlefield, international implications emerged. Ramming discussions in Western capitals gained urgency, with several officials pointing to Pokrovsk as evidence that Ukraine can decisively blunt Russian offensives if provided with adequate support. Analysts argued that reinforcing Ukraine's drone, artillery, and electronic warfare capabilities could replicate this success across the front. Pokrovsk became a case study in the effectiveness of asymmetric, intelligence-driven defense strategies. Back in Russia, however, the narrative grew more unstable. As news of the losses spread through private military channels and soldiers' social media circles, the Kremlin faced the uncomfortable task of containing public reaction. Families began organizing online groups to track missing troops, many of whom were last seen near Pokrovsk. Local administrators prepared condolence statements but were instructed to delay publication until the Ministry of Defense finalized its official numbers. That process, as always, moved slowly. Yet no amount of censorship could hide the silence coming from front-line soldiers who stopped responding to messages. In many regions, the absence of communication spoke louder than any announcement. The Pokrovsk losses were large enough to be felt across Russia, from villages where 3 or 4 men were sent to the same battalion to cities where mobilized reservists formed entire units now broken apart. Still, Russia continues pushing reinforcements toward the area, determined to regain momentum and prevent the Pokrovsk setback from becoming a lasting symbol of weakness. New units, some composed of recently mobilized men, others pulled from calmer sectors, are already moving toward the front. But whether these troops can stabilize the situation remains uncertain. What they're walking into is a battlefield already shaped by the failures of those who came before them. The ground near Pokrovsk remains scarred, not just physically, with burned vehicles and cratered fields, but strategically with weakened morale, disrupted communications, and shaken command confidence. Ukrainian forces, positioned firmly, continue monitoring every movement with the same drones, sensors, and intelligence networks that exposed the earlier assault. Russia may attempt another push, but it will do so under the shadow of the defeat it suffered here. Russia's internal political landscape is now feeling the tremors of what happened near Pokrovsk. Though the Kremlin maintains strict control over state media, the sheer scale of the losses has made full censorship impossible. Telegram channels aligned with various factions of the Russian elite are quietly pointing fingers, not at the soldiers, but at generals whose decision-making appears increasingly disconnected from the realities on the ground. Inside the Ministry of Defense, tension is rising. Several senior officers reportedly warned that pushing too aggressively toward Pokrovsk without proper reconnaissance would overstretch already exhausted units. Their concerns were dismissed. The result was more than a failed offensive. It became a public embarrassment for a military that claims to be evolving, modernizing, and learning from previous failures. Instead, Pokrovsk revealed that many old problems remain entirely unresolved. The political pressure is being felt most sharply by regional governors. They face a dilemma: acknowledge the rising casualty numbers coming from their districts, or risk open anger from families demanding answers. With each passing day, more relatives join online groups searching for the missing. Many of these groups have become unexpectedly influential, and even pro-government voices hesitate to antagonize them. Pokrovsk has begun to reshape how Russians perceive the war, not as a distant patriotic duty, but as a grim equation where their own communities are paying the price. Across the border, Ukraine is preparing for the next phase. Commanders understand that Russia, despite its losses, still has the manpower to continue attacking. But they also know that the Pokrovsk offensive revealed a predictable pattern. Whenever Russia masses troops without coordinating drones, artillery, and electronic warfare, it becomes vulnerable to the kind of layered defenses Ukraine has mastered. The question now is whether Russia will adapt or repeat its mistakes. Ukrainian intelligence units are already monitoring supply lines feeding Russian reinforcements. Rail corridors and munition depots and staging areas are being tracked in real time. Any sign of buildup triggers drone mapping sessions, preparing artillery teams for possible strikes. Ukrainian analysts are also studying Russian movements for hints of a shift in strategy. Some believe Moscow may abandon wide front assaults in favor of smaller, more concentrated thrusts. Others argue Russia might attempt to open pressure on a different sector entirely, hoping to stretch Ukraine's defenses. But despite these possibilities, the psychological edge now lies with Ukraine. Soldiers who defended Pokrovsk describe a renewed confidence. They've seen the effects of their tactics firsthand. The coordination, the drone work, the precision timing. They know they can halt Russian advances when supported properly. This morale boost is invaluable, especially in a war defined by attrition, exhaustion, and grinding daily pressure. Within Russia, however, morale continues to erode. Leaked audio from Russian troops paints a bleak picture of life near the front. Soldiers speak of shortages in basic gear, thermal imagers, drone jammers, even medical supplies. Some describe walking for kilometers under fire just to retrieve ammunition. Others mention that commanders avoid visiting frontline positions, fearing drone strikes. As trust disintegrates, discipline falters, and cohesion breaks down, problems that become catastrophic in high-intensity battles like those near Pokrovsk. Internationally, the Pokrovsk setback has forced analysts to reassess Russia's ability to sustain large-scale offensives. Many believed Moscow had regained momentum in recent months. But the losses near Pokrovsk, while not the largest in the war, represent a critical strategic failure at a moment when Russia was attempting to project strength. The damage is not only physical, it's reputational. Military planners in NATO are now reevaluating the intensity of Russian assaults and the vulnerabilities exposed by modern drone warfare. This also places pressure on Ukraine's allies. Supporters of increased military aid now point to Pokrovsk as evidence that Ukraine can halt, and even reverse, Russian advances if given enough tools. Critics, however, warn that Ukraine must not rely solely on defensive victories and should push for long-term strategic planning. On the ground, the terrain around Pokrovsk remains a graveyard of machinery. Burnt hulls of armored vehicles sit half buried in soft soil. Trenches carved through farmlands are littered with abandoned equipment. Collapsed dugouts show signs of chaotic retreats. Each site tells a story of units caught between orders to advance and the crushing firepower that awaited them. Nightfall brings no relief. Ukrainian drones operate around the clock, using thermal imaging to track troop movements. Russian soldiers, aware of the constant surveillance, spend hours motionless, terrified of being detected. Even resupply missions must be carried out under cover of darkness, and even then, the fear of unseen drones hangs over every vehicle. And still, Moscow pushes forward. Fresh battalions are arriving, many composed of mobilized men with minimal training. Some were reportedly given only 4 or 5 days to prepare before deployment. For these new arrivals, the Pokrovsk sector is their introduction to the war, and they are walking directly into an environment shaped by the failures of their predecessors. Whether these reinforcements can stabilize the line remains uncertain. Ukrainian commanders expect another major Russian push, but they also predict that morale and logistical weaknesses will hamper Russia before the next offensive can fully form. If that prediction holds true, Russia may be forced into yet another costly cycle of attacks and retreats. Pokrovsk has become a symbol not just of loss, but of exposure. It shows what happens when outdated strategies collide with modern, adaptive defenses. It shows the limits of sheer manpower in a battlefield dominated by drones, sensors, and precision artillery. It shows the consequences of ignoring warnings from the front. And it shows something else, that Ukraine, even under immense pressure, can still deliver blows that reshape the strategic landscape. Russia's leadership is now entering a phase it has tried to avoid since the earliest days of the invasion, the phase where battlefield failures begin to bleed visibly into the political arena. The losses near Pokrovsk didn't just weaken military units. They fractured the illusion of coherence that Moscow has relied on to maintain public confidence. And while the Kremlin is skilled at suppressing dissent, the aftershocks from Pokrovsk are spreading in ways that even internal security agencies struggle to contain. Behind closed doors, several factions inside the Russian government are privately clashing. Hardliners demand an even more aggressive mobilization effort, arguing that only overwhelming numbers can offset the precision and adaptability of Ukrainian defenses. More cautious advisors warn that a larger mobilization could trigger domestic unrest, especially now that the pain of Pokrovsk has rippled into regional communities across Russia. Each new casualty notification fuels quiet discontent. Each unanswered message from a frontline soldier becomes a spark that travels from one family to the next. Inside the Russian military itself, the fallout is even more intense. Staff officers who had been confident in their calculations now face scrutiny from superiors searching for someone to blame. Junior commanders complain they were forced into operations that made no tactical sense. Senior generals insist the problem lies with discipline and communication, not strategy. No one admits fault, yet everyone feels the pressure. The Pokrovsk setback has exposed an uncomfortable truth. Russia's battlefield cohesion is far more fragile than its leadership claims. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence continues gathering detailed information on Russia's attempts to regroup. The defensive success at Pokrovsk has given Ukrainian analysts a rare gift. Time. Time to observe how Russia adapts. Time to anticipate where the next pressure point will be. Time to fortify positions before reinforcements arrive. This breathing space is incredibly valuable in a war where momentum can shift in days. Ukrainian drone operators remain the backbone of this vigilance. They watch rail lines feeding troops toward the front. They track supply convoys moving through forested routes. They monitor temporary camps forming behind Russian lines, capturing heat signatures at night and movement patterns during the day. Each new cluster of vehicles, each freshly dug trench, each relocation of artillery becomes another data point processed by Ukrainian command. And all the while, Ukrainian forces near Pokrovsk strengthen their positions. Engineers deepen trenches, reinforce firing points, and expand networks of hidden shelters. Minefields are recalibrated. Artillery units shift locations to avoid counter-battery fire. Electronic warfare teams scan for signs of new Russian tactics. The message is clear: if Russia attempts another surge, it will face a defense even stronger than before. For Russian troops arriving as reinforcements, morale is already dangerously low. Many have heard unfiltered accounts from survivors of the Pokrovsk disaster. They know what happened. They know the scale of the losses. Some report stepping off transport trucks and immediately seeing wreckage from earlier assaults. Burned vehicles, destroyed armored carriers, pieces of equipment left untouched because retrieval would cost too many lives. These sights do not inspire confidence, they inspire dread. Several intercepted communications suggest Russian soldiers are questioning their orders more openly than before. The consequences for that are severe, but doubting them, whispering about whether regional commanders truly understand what they're sending them into. The cracks in discipline may be small now, but in a war of attrition, even minor cracks can grow rapidly. Internationally, the Pokrovsk losses are beginning to reshape how intelligence agencies evaluate the broader conflict. Analysts in Europe and North America see the battle as a turning point, evidence that Russia's offensive cycle is becoming increasingly predictable and unsustainable. Many now argue that if Ukraine can be supplied with consistent drones, precision artillery, and electronic warfare support, it can blunt Russian assaults repeatedly, eventually forcing Moscow into a defensive posture. This possibility has already sparked debate in foreign ministries. Some policymakers see an opportunity to reinforce Ukraine now, break Russia's offensive rhythm, and shift the balance of the war. Others hesitate, concerned about escalation risks if Russia interprets increased support as a direct challenge. Yet the consensus is shifting. Pokrovsk has demonstrated that Ukraine can win tactical victories even under immense pressure. Back on the ground, the atmosphere near Pokrovsk remains tense, heavy, and volatile. Ukrainian soldiers patrol trenches with caution, aware that another attack may come at any moment. The air hums with the sound of drones. Some Ukrainian, some Russian, constantly circling, constantly watching. Artillery exchanges echo through the fields. Unpredictable and relentless, the landscape itself has become a mechanism of war, cratered, burned, reshaped by explosions. But despite the danger, there is an underlying confidence among Ukrainian forces. They know they held the line. They know they inflicted one of the most significant setbacks Russia has suffered in recent months. And they know that if Russia tries again with the same tactics, the outcome may be even worse. Yet Ukraine is not complacent. Commanders warn their troops that Russia will adapt. Moscow will try new approaches. It may bring more drones, more jammers, more artillery. It may shift forces from quieter sectors. The next assault could be different, more coordinated, more concentrated, more desperate. Preparation is constant. Vigilance never stops. Further to the east, Russian units reorganizing for another assault face escalating internal challenges. Shortages in ammunition and transport vehicles slow their progress. Conflicting orders create confusion. Commanders rotate frequently, making consistency impossible. And looming over everything is the memory of what happened near Pokrovsk, a memory that shapes behavior, decisions, and morale. The world now watches closely. Analysts, governments, journalists, intelligence agencies, all are waiting to see what happens next. Will Russia regroup and attempt another large push? Will Ukraine exploit Russia's weakened state to counterattack? Will the Pokrovsk setback become a turning point or merely one chapter in a long, brutal struggle? The only certainty is that the repercussions of Pokrovsk are still unfolding politically, militarily, and psychologically. The dust over Pokrovsk is beginning to settle, but the consequences of what happened there will echo far beyond the cratered fields where the battle was fought. For Russia, the losses represent more than a tactical failure. They mark a moment when confidence cracked, when soldiers began to question the orders they followed, and when families at home realized the cost was far greater than they had been told. For Ukraine, Pokrovsk stands as proof that resilience, intelligence, and adaptability can overcome even a numerically larger force. The defenders showed that modern warfare is not won by sheer numbers, but by precision, coordination, and the ability to learn faster than the enemy. Every drone flight, every artillery correction, every defensive maneuver turned the battlefield into a lesson Russia could not avoid. Internationally, the world now understands that the war's outcome is not predetermined. Pokrovsk demonstrated that the front can shift suddenly, dramatically, and decisively when one side falters and the other seizes the moment. It reminded allies why their support matters, and reminded adversaries that underestimating Ukraine leads to costly mistakes. Yet as night falls over the shattered outskirts of Pokrovsk, there is no celebration. Ukrainian soldiers sit quietly in reinforced trenches, listening to the distant rumble of Russian artillery reestablishing its lines. They know the war is far from over. They know another assault may come, perhaps stronger, perhaps smarter, and they know that each day forward will demand the same discipline and determination that delivered this defensive victory. Across the border, Russian reinforcements move under cover of darkness, stepping into a battlefield shaped by the failures of those who came before them. Some arrive in silence, some in fear, and some in denial of the losses that await them if nothing changes. The Pokrovsk setback is a wound, not fatal, but deep, one that Moscow must either heal through adaptation or hide through force. In the end, the story of Pokrovsk is not merely a battle report. It is a warning about the cost of flawed strategy. It is a testament to the power of unity under fire. And it is a reminder that in this war, every kilometer, every trench, every night of holding the line matters. As the smoke thins and the fighting shifts, both armies move forward, one carrying momentum, the other carrying the weight of its own mistakes. Pokrovsk may fade from headlines, but its impact will endure, shaping decisions, fears, ambitions, and strategies on both sides of the front. And somewhere in the broken fields where the fighting reached its peak, the silence after the storm speaks louder than any official statement. This war is far from over. And Pokrovsk was only the beginning of what comes next.